Imagine you are a king in the Middle Ages. You have a kingdom. It's a good kingdom, full of farms and towns and people who pay you taxes. You have a wife, a queen, and you have sons. This is where the trouble starts. Your first son is the heir. He gets everything. The crown, the kingdom, the power. This system is called primogeniture. It means the firstborn inherits. It was a good system in many ways. It kept the kingdom whole. It prevented the realm from being split into smaller, weaker pieces every generation. A single, strong kingdom was more stable than a patchwork of tiny ones, so the eldest son gets the prize. Everyone knows the rules. But what about your other sons? You might have 2, 3, maybe even 4 younger sons. They are princes. They have royal blood. They grew up in a castle. They learned to fight, to lead soldiers, to expect respect. They are ambitious, proud, and probably a little bit jealous of their older brother. They have no kingdom to rule. They have no great inheritance to look forward to. They are a problem. A younger son with no purpose is a dangerous thing. He could get ideas. He might think, why should my brother get everything? I'm just as smart, just as strong. Maybe I should be king. He could gather supporters, nobles who are unhappy with the current king. He could start a rebellion, a civil war. This wasn't just a hypothetical threat. It happened, all the time. Brothers fought brothers for the throne, and these wars could tear a kingdom apart. So, as the king, you have to do something with these spare sons. You can't just ignore them. They need a place in the world. They need land, money, and a title. They need a job to do, something to keep them busy and hopefully loyal. You could send them to the church. A younger son could become a powerful bishop or an abbot. This was a common solution. It gave them status and wealth, and since they couldn't have children, their power wouldn't create a new rival dynasty. But not every prince wanted to be a priest. Most were trained as warriors, not men of God. You could marry them off to a rich heiress. If a powerful duke died, leaving only a daughter, marrying her to your younger son was a great move. Your son gets his own lands to rule, and you bring that duke's territory more tightly into the royal family's orbit. This worked, but you had to be lucky. There weren't always wealthy, single heiresses available at the right time. So you need another tool. You need a way to provide for your sons directly from your own resources. You need to give them a piece of the pie, but not the whole pie. You need to make them powerful enough to be content, but not so powerful they become a threat to the crown. This is the problem that the appanage was designed to solve. The word appanage comes from an old French term, appaner, which means to provide with bread. That's a simple, humble way to put it. An appanage was a gift of land and titles given by a sovereign to his younger children, especially his sons. It was their provision, their bread. It was a chunk of the royal domain, a county or a duchy, carved out and handed over to a prince. He would be the duke of this or the count of that. He would have his own court, his own lands to manage, his own revenues. This wasn't just a gift. It was a political strategy. It was a pressure valve. By giving a younger son an appanage, the king hoped to turn a potential rival into a loyal supporter. The son would be a great lord in his own right, a magnate of the realm. He would have a vested interest in the stability of the kingdom because his own wealth and power depended on it. He would be a powerful ally for his brother, the new king, helping him govern the realm and defend its borders. The idea was simple. Keep your family happy. A happy prince with his own duchy is less likely to start a war to steal his brother's kingdom. The appanage was a trade-off. The king gave away direct control over some of his land in exchange for family loyalty and political peace. It seemed like a smart, elegant solution to the perennial problem of the spare heir. But like many simple solutions to complex problems, it had consequences, and those consequences would shape the history of kingdoms for centuries. So, the king decides to create an appanage for his second son, Prince John. What does that actually mean? What does John get, and what are the rules? It wasn't as simple as just handing over a map with a circle drawn on it. An appanage was a complex legal and political arrangement. First, John would receive a territory. This wasn't just empty land, it was a functioning part of the kingdom. It might be a county like Anjou or a duchy like Berry. This territory came with people, towns, castles, and farms. It also came with rights. As the new Duke of Berry, John would have the right to collect taxes and feudal dues from the people living there. He could mint his own coins, though usually they had to acknowledge the king in some way. He could hold his own courts and dispense justice for most crimes. He could raise his own small army from the knights and lords who lived in his duchy. He was in effect a mini-king in his own domain. He would have his own council of advisors, his own treasury, his own administration. For the people living in Berry, he was their direct lord. They paid their taxes to him, not directly to the king in Paris. They served in his army, not the king's. This gave him real, tangible power. He wasn't just a prince with a fancy title and a pension. He was a ruler, but there was a catch, and it was a big one. He was still a subject of the king. His brother, the king, was his overlord. This was the core of the feudal relationship. John, as the Duke of Berry, had to swear an oath of fealty and homage to the king. He was the king's vassal. This meant he had duties. If the king went to war, John was expected to show up with his troops and fight for him. He had to give the king advice when asked. He couldn't make alliances with the king's enemies. His duchy was part of the Kingdom of France, not an independent country. The king still retained certain rights within the appanage. These were called regalian rights. The king might have the final say in the most serious legal cases, the right to appeal. He could often still tax the church within the appanage. The exact balance of power between the king and the prince who held the appanage was a constant source of negotiation and, sometimes, conflict. A strong king could enforce his rights and keep his brother in line. A weak king might find his brother the duke acting more and more like an independent ruler. One of the most important questions was about inheritance. What happens when Prince John, the Duke of Berry, dies? Does the land go back to the king, or does it go to John's own son? This was a critical detail, and the rules changed over time. In the beginning, some appanages were for life only. When the prince died, the land returned to the royal domain, the lands controlled directly by the king. This was the safest option for the crown, but princes naturally wanted to provide for their own children. They pushed for their appanages to be hereditary. Over time, this became the norm. John's son would inherit the Duchy of Berry, and so a new noble house, a cadet branch of the royal family, was created. The House of Berry would be descended from kings, but they were now a separate line. This created a new problem. If you kept carving out appanages for younger sons, and those appanages became hereditary, the royal domain would shrink with every generation. The king would control less and less land directly, and more of the kingdom would be in the hands of his powerful cousins. This was a long-term recipe for a weak monarchy. To solve this, kings started putting new rules in place. The most important was the rule of reversion. They might grant an appanage to their son and his male heirs only. If that son's line of male descendants died out, the appanage would automatically revert, or return, to the crown. It could not be inherited by a daughter or passed to another family through marriage. This was a clever way to keep the land in the family in the broadest sense. It ensured that these great territories would eventually come back under direct royal control, instead of being permanently lost. So, the appanage was a balancing act. It had to be generous enough to satisfy an ambitious prince and keep him loyal. It gave him real power, real wealth, and a dynasty of his own. But it was also wrapped in legal conditions designed to protect the long-term power of the king. The prince was a ruler, but he was also a subject. His lands were his own, but they were also part of the kingdom. This delicate balance was often hard to maintain, and when it failed, the results could be explosive. France is where the appanage system was most fully developed. The French kings, especially the Capetian dynasty, used it extensively. They had a large kingdom and often large families. Appanages seemed like the perfect way to manage their internal family politics. For a while it worked. It helped consolidate the kingdom by placing royal princes in charge of newly acquired territories. But the French experience also provides the most dramatic example of how an appanage could go terribly, horribly wrong. The story of the Duchy of Burgundy is the ultimate cautionary tale. In 1363, the old line of Dukes of Burgundy died out. The duchy, a large and wealthy territory, reverted to the French crown. King John II of France had a decision to make. He could have kept this rich land for himself, adding it to the royal domain. This would have made him and future kings much more powerful. Instead, he gave it as an appanage to his fourth and favorite son, Philip. Philip was known as Philip the Bold. This act of fatherly generosity would have unforeseen and catastrophic consequences for France. Philip the Bold was not content to be just a loyal son and brother. He was shrewd, ambitious, and very good at politics. He married the heiress to the County of Flanders, an incredibly wealthy region famous for its cloth trade. Suddenly, his appanage wasn't just Burgundy, it was a sprawling collection of territory stretching from central France up to the North Sea. He was no longer just a French prince, he was a major European power in his own right. His son, John the Fearless, inherited this powerful state. He was even more ambitious and ruthless than his father. He saw himself as a rival to his cousin, the King of France, who was unfortunately prone to bouts of madness. John the Fearless used his power base in Burgundy to interfere in French politics, leading a political faction and eventually assassinating his main rival, the king's brother. This plunged France into a brutal civil war between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, the faction loyal to the French crown. The Appanage, created to ensure peace and loyalty, had become the engine of civil war. The situation got even worse under the next duke, Philip the Good. He was a master of statecraft. He expanded his territories in the Netherlands, creating a rich, prosperous, and culturally vibrant state. His court at Dijon was one of the most magnificent in Europe, far grander than the French king's. He acted like a king in all but name. He made treaties with England, France's mortal enemy in the Hundred Years' War. At times, he was openly allied with the English against the French king. The Duke of Burgundy, a prince of the French royal house, was actively helping a foreign power try to conquer France. The Appanage had become a monster that was trying to devour its creator. The final Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, took this ambition to its logical conclusion. He wanted to be a king. He tried to forge his lands into a new Middle Kingdom, a revived Lotharingia that would lie between France and the Holy Roman Empire. He spent his entire reign at war trying to conquer the final pieces of territory he needed to link his Burgundian and Dutch lands. His enemy was King Louis XI of France, a cunning and patient king known as the Universal Spider. Louis XI understood the threat Burgundy posed. He worked tirelessly to undermine Charles, using diplomacy, money, and spies. In the end, Charles the Bold's ambition outran his ability. He was killed in battle in 1477. Because he had no son, his story ended there. Under the rules of the Appanage, the Duchy of Burgundy itself reverted to the French crown. Louis XI seized it immediately. The great threat was finally over. The French kings had learned a very hard lesson. Never again would they create an appanage so large and powerful that it could challenge the monarchy itself. The Burgundy example was the most extreme, but there were other powerful French appanages. The Dukes of Anjou, Berry, and Orleans were all major players in the kingdom. They were often at the center of political intrigue and rebellion. The system created a whole class of supernobles, the princes of the blood, who had royal lineage and vast territorial power. Managing them was the central challenge for French kings for much of the late Middle Ages. The appanage had solved the problem of the younger son, but it had created a new and arguably bigger problem, the overmighty cousin. The appanage system is most famous in France, but it wasn't an exclusively French idea. Rulers across Europe faced the same problem of what to do with their non-inheriting sons. However, the way they handled it varied a lot, depending on their own traditions and political circumstances. Looking at England and the Holy Roman Empire shows just how different the solutions could be. In England, things were different. After the Norman conquest in 1066, English kings were very careful about creating large, consolidated blocks of territory for anyone, including their own sons. The memory of a divided, chaotic Anglo-Saxon England was still fresh. The Norman kings wanted a strong, centralized monarchy. They were reluctant to hand over a whole county or duchy with all its powers to a younger son, as the French kings did. They feared creating a potential rival who had a secure, independent power base. Instead of giving a son, say, the entire Duchy of Cornwall as a self-contained unit, an English king was more likely to grant him a collection of manors and castles scattered across different counties. He might also be given a title, like Earl of Cornwall, but the title didn't necessarily mean he controlled the whole territory. His power was spread out. This made it much harder for him to build a regional army and challenge the king. The English approach was to give wealth and status, but not concentrated territorial power. There were exceptions, of course. The earldoms of Chester and Lancaster became very powerful, and at times they were held by members of the royal family. The House of Lancaster, descended from a younger son of King Edward III, eventually grew powerful enough to seize the throne, starting the conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. So the English system wasn't foolproof, but in general, England avoided creating the kind of quasi-independent princely states like Burgundy that caused so much trouble in France. The English appanage, if you can call it that, was more about providing an income and a title than creating a sub-kingdom. If England represented a more centralized approach, the Holy Roman Empire was the opposite. It was a vast, sprawling, and deeply fragmented entity. The idea of a strong central monarchy with a single royal domain was much weaker here. Instead, the tradition in many German states was partible inheritance. This meant that a ruler's lands were divided among all his sons, not just given to the eldest. This tradition was the enemy of centralization. Instead of keeping a kingdom whole, it broke it up with each generation. A duchy would be split into 2, then 4, then 8 smaller and smaller pieces. This is why the map of medieval Germany looks like a shattered pane of glass, with countless tiny duchies, counties, and lordships. In this context, the French concept of an appanage, a specific grant from the royal domain, to a younger son while the main kingdom stays intact, didn't really fit. The whole system was already based on division. You could say that German princes were all getting a piece of the inheritance rather than one getting the kingdom and the others getting a consolation prize. This practice of division was a major reason why the Holy Roman Emperor was often a weak figure, and why Germany did not unify into a single kingdom like France or England until the 19th century. So, while the problem of the younger son was universal, the solutions were local. The French created the classic appanage, a grant of land and power that was a delicate and often dangerous balancing act. The English prioritized central control, granting wealth, but scattering power to prevent the rise of a rival. The Germans, in many areas, simply divided everything, leading to centuries of political fragmentation. Each system was a response to the same fundamental challenge: how to manage power, land, and family in a world where a king's greatest allies and most dangerous enemies were often his own flesh and blood. The age of the great Appanages did not last forever. Kings, especially in France, learned from their mistakes. The near destruction of the French monarchy by the Dukes of Burgundy was a lesson that was not forgotten. Over the 15th and 16th centuries, rulers began to consciously move away from this model of providing for their younger sons. The political landscape was changing, and the appanage was a feudal tool that was becoming obsolete in the age of the emerging modern state. One of the key changes was legal. Kings got smarter about the terms and conditions. After the Burgundy fiasco, King Charles V of France had already put strict rules in place. He decreed that appanages must be smaller, and, most importantly, they could not be passed on to daughters. They would revert to the crown if the male line of the holder died out. Later kings reinforced and expanded these rules. They made sure that the gift of land came with firm legal strings attached, strings that always led back to the throne. They were determined to prevent any future appanage from becoming a permanent, independent state. At the same time, the very nature of government was changing. Kings were building more centralized states. They were creating professional bureaucracies, paid civil servants who were loyal to the crown, not to a local lord. They were raising national armies funded by national taxes. In this new world, a king wanted direct control over every corner of his kingdom. He didn't want a powerful brother or cousin acting as a middleman, collecting taxes and administering justice in a large part of the realm. The existence of large, semi-independent appanages ran counter to the entire project of state building. Kings wanted to weaken the great nobles, not create new ones from their own family. So, they found new ways to provide for their younger sons, ways that didn't involve giving away huge chunks of territory. A prince might be given a cash pension from the royal treasury. This gave him wealth without giving him a territorial power base. He might be given a high-ranking but non-hereditary position, like command of the royal army or an important role at court. This gave him status and a job to do, but his power came from the king's appointment, not from his own lands. He served at the king's pleasure. The church also remained a useful option. A prince could become a cardinal, a position of immense wealth and international influence, without creating a new dynasty that would trouble future kings. These new methods achieved the original goal of the appanage, keeping the prince happy and occupied without the dangerous side effect of undermining the central authority of the crown. By the 17th century, the classic medieval appanage was largely a thing of the past in a kingdom like France. The French monarchy, under kings like Louis XIV, had become absolute. Power was concentrated entirely in the hands of the king. The idea of granting a semi-independent duchy to a younger brother would have been unthinkable. The great feudal lords, including the princes of the blood who were descended from old appanages, were now courtiers living at the Palace of Versailles, their power decorative rather than real. What then is the legacy of the appanage? It was a system that shaped the political map of Europe. The borders of many regions and the identities of powerful noble families were forged by these grants. The appanage system was a major factor in the great power struggles of the late Middle Ages, most notably the conflict between France and Burgundy, which defined an era. It was also a transitional system. It was a feudal solution to a problem of dynastic politics. For a time, it helped kingdoms manage the difficult tensions within royal families. But it was an unstable solution. It demonstrated the inherent weakness of a purely feudal monarchy, where power was based on personal relationships and grants of land. The failure of the appanage system, its tendency to create rebels and rivals, pushed kings to develop new forms of power. It forced them to build stronger, more centralized states where loyalty was to the crown, as an institution, not just to the family member who wore it. The appanage was a medieval tool that, by its very flaws, helped pave the way for the modern state. It was a solution that eventually became a bigger problem, and in solving that new problem, kings changed the very nature of their rule.